to have the license, private banks to have the license, but they control in terms of what sort of areas they can finance, or what sort of areas they can operate, open their branches and so on. Okay, so just having the banks is not sufficient. It is also, we need to look at the operation of those private banks, whether there are any entry barrier or so on, okay, in terms of the expansion of their branches and so on, okay. And also, these private banks are subject to very high reserve requirement, okay, because this high reserve requirement controls these private banks' ability to lend money, because the higher the reserve requirement, that your ability to lend money will be lower. And as a private bankers, if the high reserve requirement reduces your ability, then you have to cover your interest rate, or you have to charge a very high interest rate to cover your cost. Okay? So the high reserve requirement is one of the reasons why in the developing countries the lending cost, the lending rate is quite high. Okay? Because on the reserve amount there is no interest paid, and this reserve is maintained in the central bank, and sometimes this central bank lends money to the government. Okay? So if the government is having a fiscal deficit, then the high reserve requirement means that the central bank will be able to lend money to the government, but at the cost of the operation of the private banks, where they will not be able to lend the total amount of reserve they have got, total amount of deposit they have got, and therefore they will be charging high interest rate on the rest of the amount. And also there is this compulsory lending, which is the mandated lending, the compulsory lending to the government and the priority sectors. So the government, if many banks are owned by the states, then the government will borrow money from the state. It could be just to finance the state-owned enterprises, or it could be to finance the government deficit to run the day-to-day expenditure of the government. Okay? But it is mostly the state-owned enterprises, the state-owned banks, they finance the losses incurred by the state-owned manufacturing enterprises. Okay? So in countries where there are many state-owned manufacturing enterprises, like fertilizer, pharmaceutical, petrochemical, and so on, big enterprises where they are not earning enough profit, then every year government needs to inject funds in those manufacturing enterprises. Now to finance these enterprises, the government needs to have control over the banking system as well. Because if the government doesn't have any banks, then no one will finance these losing concerns. Right? They cannot borrow money. So they go hand in hand, where you have got these state-owned manufacturing enterprises which are not profitable, which are not efficient. Also, you find that many banks also will be owned by the state to finance these losing farms, losing state-owned farms. And also, the government sometimes controls the credit of the private banks, so that these private banks will have to lend a certain fraction of their total lending to the priority sectors, and these priority sectors are set by the government. It is not the banks who will select these sectors. It is the state or the government will determine the priority sectors, and then they will say that, okay, the 30%, minimum 30% of the credit should go to the priority sector. For example, agriculture, for example, rural economy, for example, small and medium scaling SME, the small and medium enterprises. Okay, so there are different types of priority sectors that could be identified by the state, and then the operation of the commercial banks, whether private or public, should go along with these priority sectors or set by the state. Okay, so these are some of the features of the repressed financial system. Then here this is a very simple, like a demand supply analysis here. Okay, here we say that, well, suppose the supply, that the S is savings. Of course, the saving is same as supply, and the investment is demand. So the I for investment. So you've got the investment and you've got the savings. Now, if you've got a ceiling, let's say instead of R star, if you control the interest rate at R1, so at if the deposit ceiling is at R1 deposit rate, so the savers will get this much interest rate. And if there is no ceiling on the interest rates, then at this R1 rate, where the overall investment will be much lower, then the banks will charge R2 interest rate for lending. Okay? So there is a control over the savings rate, but there is no control over the lending rate, let's say. So the R1 will be the interest rate to be paid to the depositors, and the R2 will be the interest rate that will be charged from the borrowers. Okay? So there is a huge gap. The R1, R2 is a gap. Okay? So the overall investment and the savings will be at I1. So there will be a large spread, and that will lead to high bank profits, okay? Because there is a huge gap. So that's your income. R2 is your income, and the R1 is your cost. So the gap is your income. And this is called the interest spread. And this interest spread is used in many empirical analysis as the efficiency of the banking system. The larger the spread, the less efficient or the more inefficient a banking system is. Okay? A developed banking system or an efficient banking system should not have a huge spread. Normally, we expect this spread should be around 2 to 3%, because you need some profit as well in the banks, because there's an overhead cost, there's the branch cost, the salaries of the employees, and so on. They need a little bit of profit. But there should not be this high, where you have got, in many countries, the spread is around 7 to 10%. Okay? The gap between the lending rate and the deposit rate. Okay? So, which will increase the bank's profit. But if you control both R1, so if you say that, well, the interest rate cannot be more than R1, then the gap will be this much, the AB, because the supply will be up to here, but the demand will be up to here. So the AB is the amount of credit rationing, basically. Okay, so the excess supply, or you can say the amount of credit rationing. Now, what happens when the interest rate is R1? Then many unprofitable projects, many commercial projects will become viable, right? Because if you're aware, if you still remember your first year investment theory, right, where you calculate the net present value in the investment theory in your first year macro, where you say that net present value is the future stream of income divided by 1 plus R, 1 plus R squared, 1 plus R cubed, 1 plus R to the power 4, blah, 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 okay? So here what we are doing, we are lowering the R here, okay, the discount rate, the R. So if you lower the R, then of course the many NPV, the negative NPV will become positive NPV, right? Because the denominator is getting smaller, so the ratio is higher, so the NPV will always be positive. And when the NPV is positive, you say, oh, the project is commercially viable. But it is because you are controlling R. So therefore, at a very low interest rate, we say that the financing less risky projects with a lower rates of return, because your cost of borrowing is very low. So you can always go for any investment because it will be profitable. So the lower return project will be financed, so there will be a low productivity of investment, because you don't have to earn a huge profit, because your borrowing cost is quite low. So, and also when the interest rate is controlled like that, as in many developing countries, then it will encourage more consumption, because the savings is discouraged at a low interest rate. Okay? So there will be more current consumption, and also at that low interest rate, the investor will go for capital intensive investment. Because the capital is cheaper. So instead of labor intensive investment, you have got the capital intensive investment. And also, some of the lenders can become investor, because instead of being a saver, it is better to be an investor, because the investment means you can borrow money at a lesser rate. The saving means you can get only very low interest earning from your savings. So instead of being a lender, you become an investor, okay, or borrower. Now, so therefore we say that this sort of repression will cause the economic inefficiency, and also it might enable the authorities to deal with the problems of market failure and financial risk. So I think that is one of the reasons why the financial repression still exists, that when the rates are controlled, then it enables the authorities to deal with the problems of the market failure and the financial risk. Because see, what I said here, that when the interest rate is controlled, which is at R1, the financing less risky projects with low return. Because if your return is, when the risk is low, then the return is also low. Then possibly the government may think that when the interest rate is low, the banks will not gamble. They will not compete with each other to earn more money and to earn bonus and so on. So therefore, we can control this type of unhealthy competition amongst the banks, and therefore we can avoid the financial risk. okay, by controlling the interest rate. Okay. Now, based on the empirical evidence, we found that in East Asia there was a moderate financial repression. So there was a repression, but it was mild. Okay. So there was a mild financial repression in the form of financial restraint, and there was a directed credit to the priority areas to support the industrial policies. So the government, yes, in the East Asian countries, the government set the priority sectors. Now, to guide or to channel the credit to those sectors, the government established few large banks. As I said, the development banks normally say. It could be, if you want to promote agricultural export, you come up with the agricultural development bank. If you want to support certain industrial sector, let's say electronic industry, then the government may have got its own industrial development bank. And that industrial development bank will finance the electronic industry, let's say, because the promotion of the electronic industry is part of their industrial policy. So you have got the industrial policy. So to feed or to comply with the industrial policy, you set up the banks, and that bank will support the industrial policy as well. Okay? So that's why there is a financial restraint, which means that the banks are not free to choose their borrower. They are guided by the state that, okay, these are our priority sector for the next 10 years or 20 years. So we want to promote agriculture, we want to promote electronics, or we want to promote export sectors. So these banks will have to lend money to these sectors first. So there is a restraint, and also there is a directed credit, okay, to support the industrial policy. But these are all made for the remedy of the market failures, because in a normal situation, normally the banks, they do not want to lend money to the new sector. If a country is very much agricultural, or if a country is very much dependent on the oil sector, for some reason, suppose the country wants to move away from the oil industry. Let's say the oil price has gone down now. Okay? So the many countries may think that, okay, we should promote our electronic industry, because we should not depend on the oil, because there are many alternatives of the oil is coming up in the global market. The oil price is quite low, so therefore the countries should have they should diversify their export. But when you are moving towards a new export sector, the banks may not lend money to the new sector, because it is quite risky, because there is no proven record that these sectors will be successful. And therefore the banks may not lend money to the new sectors. So that unless you have got this state guidance of the state intervention to channel fund to those sectors, then these new sectors of the diversification of the export may not take place. Okay? So then there will be a market failure, because the private lenders will not be, private lenders try to, if you are my borrower, then I would rather prefer to give you more money if you want to expand your business. But if someone new comes, let's say he or she is a small borrower, then I say, no, I'm happy with lending money to 3 people rather than lending money to 30 people, because I can't monitor 30 people. It's very expensive, and I don't know you as well. There is no credit relationship between you and me. So I'd rather give money to my old client and so on. So this is a common nature of the banks. And that will definitely lead to market failure, because then the new sectors cannot grow. Okay? So therefore, the government wants to address this market failure by intervening in the financial sector, or by constructing or various development banks. And in China, initially, this repression helped the economy initially, but then in 1990s, the same level of repression found to be causing a negative impact. So initially, the control of the financial sector by the state